She woke to the sea murmuring through the stone. A voice in the bones of the rock, low and endless, and the same day after day. The shutters were shut against the dawn, but the light already bruised their edges, and wind tapped a finger at the iron latch, impatient. Cersei lay still and listened to the murmurs. Scrape of rope on moorings far below in Lannisport, clack of gulls, the long whisper of water slipping its shoulders over the pebbles, the faintest clatter from kitchens where 100 hands began their choreographed day. There was comfort in the predictability of it. There was insult too. The world had learned to move without asking her leave. When she slid from the bed, the cold of the flagstones rushed up through her arches. The floor had been freshly scrubbed the night before. She could smell lye beneath the beeswax. A fire had burned low and tidy in the grate, obedient as every other thing in this chamber. She crossed to the shutters and set the latch aside. Wind pushed against her wrists and her hair, a golden spill that the breeze caught as if to turn it into a pennon. The sea looked close enough to touch and immeasurably far, green near the cliffs, paling to a quiet brightness toward the horizon. Lannisport crouched under the morning. Roofs sprung bright with dew and chimneys painting the sky with careful smoke. Ships sat moored like beetles clinging to the quay. Beyond them, the salt road made its pale line through the fields. Beyond that again, the west rolled and rolled until it turned into the rest of the world. A knock came, single, then two in polite succession. Taya slipped in when Cersei said nothing, accustomed to that. She was a small brown-haired girl with ingenious hands, and Cersei sometimes thought that if Taya were given a bolt of silk and enough time, she could sew a whisper into it. The girl bobbed and kept her eyes tidy. "A warm basin for you, my lady," she said, and set it under the window where the light could find the steam and turn it to gold. "Leave it," Cersei said. The wind played with a strand of her hair and she let it. She could feel the rock's pulse on the sill, a thrum so faint that most never noticed it, but she had listened during sleepless nights until the whole fortress seemed a living thing on which she slept like a flea. "Is my father awake?" "He is always awake," Taya said, and when she heard her own boldness she colored, but Cersei did not correct her. "The steward said Lord Tywin is in his solar. There is a man from Tarbeck with a ledger and cheeks like apples." Cersei dipped a cloth and wrung it out. Water striped her wrists. "Tarbeck?" she said. "There is no Tarbeck," Taya stammered. "Tarbeck Mill, my lady, on the coast. He had that on his cap." "Ah." Cersei pressed the warm cloth over her eyes and thought of the name as a stone dropped into a still pool, how it sank without a sound. The people of the West kept old names on their tongues without quite remembering if they tasted of pride or salt. "Has there been a raven?" "Yes, my lady. It came in the night." Taya took a folded scrap from the sleeve of her dress. "For Lord Tywin. Not for me." "No, my lady." "Of course," Cersei said and lowered the cloth. Her gaze followed the chisel-marked line of the window embrasure, a groove worn smooth by the hands of women who had stood here before her to feel wind that spoke of the rest of the world. "Tell the kitchens I will break my fast later. Bread, honey, a soft-boiled egg, and the lemon water." "Yes, my lady." Taya hesitated, a small held breath. "The seamstress wants to show you the new brocade from Lannisport. It has lions woven in. Everything has lions woven in." Cersei took the comb from the table and dragged it through her hair until the catching smoothed and the light made a glittering chiaroscuro of it. "Tell her to bring it in an hour." When Taya had gone, Cersei combed again. She liked the drag of the comb and the sense of order returning to what had slept chaotic. A lock refused. She worked at it, patient, until it lay docile over her shoulder. In the glass, she saw a woman the West would recognize, the exact gold Tywin's name implied. Her mouth set itself too easily. She softened it and found the young girl who had merrily believed the roads in front of her straight and well swept. That girl had learned long ago to swallow her hunger until it sharpened her. She dressed without calling for help. The gown was green, the green of last year's coin newly polished. It held her like a hand breathes against a throat. She did not neck her hair in rings. She let it down her back as if she were walking into a hall in which every eye should know how long it was. She made herself slow. Walking through Casterly Rock demanded a measured stride. Rushing offended the place, as if one were to sprint through a god's prayers. She passed the carved lions that preceded the stair to her father's solar, their eyes cut smooth by Robert's grandfather's mason, a detail she had been told too many times to forget. The smell of parchment and candle smoke began 3 steps before the door. The guard there knuckled his brow and swung the oak open without announcement. No one announced themselves to Tywin Lannister. He knew the steps of those who lived with him. He had weighed them. The solar was sunlight and paper. Tywin had set his desk against the window not to look outside. Cersei had never known him to gaze idly, but to bully the light to work for him. He did not rise. He never had. He had not when kings had entered this room long before she was born. He looked up, and that was the same as a bow from another man. "You are awake early," he said. "The sea woke me." She let the chair opposite him find her, the one he kept there for those he tolerated. Beside the desk, a ledger gray as slate sat propped on a stool like a dog that knew tricks. The man from the mill with apple cheeks stood, hat wrung, eyes on the floor with the reverence he might show. An idol. He would be dismissed in a moment, weighed and set aside. There was always someone being dismissed in Tywin's presence. It made the air a fraction cooler. "Go," Tywin said to the man, and the man bowed himself out. The door closed. "Your brother returns this afternoon. Jaime." The name flooded her chest and left a fine ache. "I had not been told." "I have told you now. How long can he stay?" Tywin's gaze returned to the papers. "Leave will be brief." "Of course." She sat straighter. "Why is he coming?" "Because he has been sent where he is told, and because he does what is necessary. The king hunts in the Kingswood. It will be dull. He will grow bored of killing stags and drinking and wish to see a place that is not made of pines. The King's Guard cannot be everywhere at once, though one would think they tried. Jaime on a horse at noon. Jaime's laugh thrown down the stair like a gauntlet to every dark corridor. Jaime's hair, the same gold as hers, set ablaze by the sun. She did not smile. She would not give Tywin that. "And King Robert?" she asked. "Does he mean to come?" "Not today." A pause, almost imperceptible. Tywin's hand shifted a sheaf of parchment. The topmost bore a broken seal of blue wax, a black stag's head impressed with a stamp that had been poorly inked before it cooled. "There has been a miscarriage." The room arranged itself in silence around the word. The candles guttered delicately, as if reluctant to disturb it. Cersei let the pause grow until it was ripe with her calculated disinterest. "The Queen," Tywin said. He said it exactly as he might say the Riverlands, a useful piece on a board. "They have lost a child." "Again," Cersei said. The word tasted like the first bite of something lemon bitter that would sweeten if she endured it. She considered her own hands where they lay, the left on the right, the rings lined like obedient soldiers across their barracks. "When?" "Last fortnight." "And our maester says?" "Our maester says that a woman's body can only be asked so many questions in so many years." His glance clipped her face, weighing not the grief she did not feel but the interest she did not trouble to hide. "It is no matter for us." Everything was a matter for them. It was what she had been bred to believe, and the belief had never disappointed her. "There will be letters," she said, and reached for the one before him. A thing with its nose in the air, eager to be read. He laid his hand across it. He did not need to say no. She withdrew her fingers. "The Crown's physicians say the Queen is robust," Tywin said. "They always say the proper word. She is not yet past birthing further children." "Yet." The syllable perched and waited for its echo. Tywin did not indulge it. "A tournament has been ordered for the King's Name Day, to be held in King's Landing. A thing of banners and fools. We will send a purse large enough to be seen and not large enough to be made a habit. We will send one of our own to see and to be seen." "Not me," Cersei said, and smiled with no teeth. "You do not send your daughter where she cannot end a game she begins. The king has a wife. King Robert had a wife whether she wore red hair or gold," Tywin said. "You do not go because you will not want to go. and because if I asked you would do the opposite from peak. If you asked me to breathe, Father, I would stop, she said lightly. But he had already returned to a column of numbers that did not argue. The wind knocked at the window. Tywin did not look toward it. If he had had a god, it would have been order. He would have asked it for coin-clinking miracles and steadied quills, for men who did what they were meant to do without being told twice, for ledgers that added clean. He would have told it when it was being foolish. This, he said, and turned the letter without letting her take it, letting her read as one might allow a cat to lap from a saucer if one kept 2 fingers at the edge of the dish, is from John Arryn. He writes himself, not one of his underlings. Old men who have written all their lives still remember how. Tywin's voice made even the compliment spare. He says the king grows restless. There is a list of ships and debts here. There is also a quiet complaint that the master of coin makes footmen of princes when he likes. Baelish. Cersei tasted the name. It was new enough at court to interest her. Slim as a needle and twice as careful. The little lord with the fog of harmlessness around him. And the queen. Tywin's look asked her what the world must look like through the narrow slit of her obsessions. The queen is quiet. She is a Tully. They are full of watery disappointments. Their eyes always seem about to weep for something tedious. Tywin's pen clicked, a sound as soft and cutting as a knife's tip set to the underside of a bird's throat. The Tullus held a river you needed. You cannot drink contempt. Remember that if you need ever again to drink something. Cersei sat back. I remember everything. I know that you do, he said, almost tired. And remember this, your mind is not a river. It is an edifice. When you choose, you can let the water run where you please. Sermon delivered, he returned to the numbers. It freed Cersei to consider the shape of the morning. They dined at the 2nd hour, her father and Tyrion and a sprinkling of cousins who came and went as if the rock were a sun around which they made eccentric orbits. The table was spread with pale bread and butter so fresh it tasted of grass, and the egg she had ordered, and slices of cold capon that had given its skin straight to Tywin's hounds. Tyrion came late, and when the door opened, conversation made room for his presence the way a hawk makes room for a wren's complaint. Out of politeness, not deference. My lady sister, he said sturdily, and bowed a bow that was everything invisible. You glisten, as always, as if you had been polished. By a steward, and you should be polished by one, like the pewter when it begins to dull, she said, sipping her lemon water. Tyrion scrambled into his chair and summoned a dish with the confidence of a man whose smallest orders would be obeyed by the largest halls. They tell me Jaime returns, he said around a mouthful of bread. They tell everyone, Cersei said. Soon you will have learned it from a carved lion. He brings the king's wind at his back, Tyrion said. We may be smelling the perfume of the royal hunting parties before long. What courage I gain from the thought. The Kingswood stags will breathe easier, to know we are safe with our windows shuttered. Tywin set his cup down without sound. This house does not cower behind shutters. No, father, Tyrion said promptly. We sit in chairs so comfortable that we forget the shutters are even there. Enough, Tywin said, not loudly, and the conversation rethreaded itself around him. Cersei ate her egg with the measured appetite of a woman who refuses to be governed by needs of the body. She thought of the blue wax, of a child never born to a queen whose face she had studied closely at the coronation. Her mouth too soft for a crown. She thought of the hair, red as a flame on a river, against the black beard of the man who had been meant for her when she was old enough to be meant for anything. She thought of the way the gods had proved themselves petty, which was the only way gods ever proved themselves. After the meal, when she had endured the steward's recitation of barrels and bushels, narrow things that fell from his mouth like spilled buttons, she took herself to the galleries. There were passages in the rock that even the rock forgot. She knew them. They ran between walls and under floors and sometimes through the solid stone itself. Tunnels made by men who had wanted to never be seen again and by men who would not admit they had been afraid. In one such passage, the air tasted of lime and old bread crusts. In another, the stone wept. She placed her palm against a damp trickle and felt the cold creep up her arm like a cat that had not been properly tamed. She had been a girl in these places with her brother at her back. Both of them made minute by the dimness and yet lion-hearted because they had taught each other how. They had been children that belonged to no nurse in those corridors, just as they had belonged to no company but their own when they ran over the roof at moonrise, certain that the sky would become their pet if they whistled for it long enough. She did not go to the roof now. She came instead to the old viewing gallery that looked over the foundry yards where ingots lay cooling like piglets made of bloodless metal. Smoke stitched itself across the air. Men shouted not in anger but to insist that their words win against the clamor of their work. A boy carried a mold with both hands, his mouth set in a careful line. It tipped and Worth melted across the dust in a molten letter. Cersei watched and for a moment found herself small again, hidden in coral-dark corridors with her brother's warm breath at her hairline. She closed her eyes and opened them. The present arrived like a knife set back on a table without apology. When Jaime came, afternoon had threaded silver into the light. She heard him before she saw him, and the hairs at her nape lifted like a dog's. He came up the steps flanked by two men in the house livery, the brown of horse and the gold of the name they wore on their sleeves, and the movement all around him paused, adjusted, resumed. He tossed his cloak to a waiting boy, not to be cruel but because his body had never been made to carry anything but its own magnificence. He had been beautiful at 15 and he had become the sort of beauty that made women want to be the mirror that beheld it. Cersei told herself to move as she would have if he were anyone else, a cousin just returned or a messenger who happened to share the shape of her mouth. She descended the final stair too quickly. He saw her and the grin came and then the check on it, as he remembered where they stood. His curtsy would have been mocking from anyone else. In him it was play. He kissed her cheek too lightly for the heat she had at his approach. He smelled of horse and pine. He smelled of the road, and something that was only him and had always been only him. "Sister," he said, in the tone that made the word a private jest and a challenge both. "Sare," she said, and let herself smile. "Your hair's too long. You told me once it was too short. It was too short then, so that I could say this to you now." "Ah," he said, "I would cut it if you asked, though I would make a ceremony of it. Bring me a chair and a septa and a priest and a cask. You would make a ceremony of anything." He stood back to look at her. He had a way of not exactly approving of what he saw, but of enjoying it anyhow. "You have not changed," he said. It meant that she had, in ways he had not yet decided to tell her. "Nor have you," she said, because her first custom would always be to reply to him with the mirror of what he had given her. "Our father says you have come on the wind of a royal hunt. Our father is never wrong. Nor are you, I suppose. Sometimes," he said, and his eyes for an instant warmed and broke and looked away. "Sometimes, shamefully, I am human." They walked. Guards kept enough distance to make it seem they were not there. Jaime greeted men by name who had last seen him when he was a boy with a sword longer than his arm, as if he had been born with the sort of memory for lesser people that makes greater ones beloved. "In King's Landing," she said, when their steps found a rhythm, "they say the Queen has lost another." "Do they?" he said. He did not look eager to speak of it, but he had never been eager to speak of women with whom he had had nothing to do and whose sadness was a duty. "The king drinks more. Or drinks the same and hides it less. I suppose those are the same thing. He should have been my husband." "There." She said it cleanly, like a window open to let the smoke out. She did not look at Jaime. He would know she did not need to look. "Do you ever think what would have happened if our father had had his way in time?" "Constantly," he said with infuriating lightness. "All the time, while I'm eating soft fruit, while I'm saddling a horse, while I'm sweating with training. But I am not sure it would have made the king less fond of wine and meat. It would have made me fond of the crown. You are fond of anything that sits on a high shelf and cannot yet be reached," he said. "You're a cat, and you are the shelf," she said. He laughed once and then set his arm for her like a gallant in a tale. She took it, They could walk this way in the open all their lives and no one would be allowed to see it. The rock would drink what the world could not swallow. She took him through the yards and into the rooms that had grown old around their family. Their forebears' faces looked down from canvases, pale eyes and the same gold always. In one portrait, a Lannister lord with an umber jaw held a hawk whose eye cut sideways. In another, a woman with a smile like a blade had a hand on a boy's shoulder, the boy looking up to find out who he was supposed to be. Jaime tipped his head at the ancestors without quite mocking them. "They are all straight-backed," he said. "They would have been smacked if they were not," she said. 100 years later, and the maids would have smacked them so their posture should stop frightening the dust. "The maid would have had a name," he said. "She would have been from a farm with a low wall, and she would have had a brother who made a bell that never rang." "Stop making things up for people who do not need them," she said. "I do not want to feel responsible for a bell." They came at last to the small terrace that bulged from the face of the rock like a coin from a sleeve. There was no guard here because there was nowhere to go. The sea threw itself wobblingly at the cliff and fell back, laughing. The wind lifted and set her hair as if testing it and found it worth passing by to the next thing. The gulls made remarks without caring whether anyone laughed. "I am told my leave is short," he said. "Who told you? Our father? Or did you just know it without being told?" "I always know the small version of bad news," he said. "It presents itself like a polite man and makes a bow." He leaned on the parapet with both hands, his right plain and his left with every knuckle like something a god might have done just to show off. "I am here 2 nights. On the 3rd morning, I ride back." "It will be enough," she said. She made the words behave like dogs that could be coaxed to go under the table and lie there, and even believe it had been their idea. There was an emptiness at the center of her that had once been filled with the certainty of the future. She had learned to carry that emptiness as if it were a jewel, heavy and treasured. "We will make it enough." He looked at her hard. As if there were writing on her face he wished to read again to see what he had missed. "What will you make, sister?" It was an indecent question. She could have said anything she liked. She let the silence answer for her, and it said, in a voice very like her father's, "What I want." At supper, the hall was a low thunder. Tywin had allowed entertainers in. Men who could juggle 4 knives in a wind. A woman who could make a lute sigh under her hand as if she were teaching it to breathe. A boy who bent backwards and walked the length of the table with his feet over his head and his smile upside down. Cousins made their submissive laughter. Rut Tiger Marbrand, with his red beard and cautious wit, told a story cleanly and did not demand anyone to laugh too loudly. Tyrion drank as if he wished to comment on the wine and tasted carefully to find words for it that would be cruel and true. Jaime talked to men who had learned to fight with the kind of patience that does not call itself patience. Cersei watched him and sometimes watched her father, and sometimes watched the way the sausages sweated grease as if it were summer in their skin. She watched everything. It was learned in her. It had become inborn. A letter came while the pairs were making their way down the table, careful as ships in a difficult harbor. The steward bowed too deeply as if apology by prostration might make up for daring interruption. "My lord," he said, and Cersei could tell by the way he took the folded paper between his finger and thumb that he knew his fingers were in the way of something larger than he was. Tywin took the letter and did not hurry. He broke the seal with 2 neat fingers. He read. The hall waited. The swords along the walls could have gnawed their own sheaths in anticipation. "To the Lord of Casterly Rock from Pax to Redwine," he said at last, and even the phrase had weight as a choice. "Ships put in at Lannisport tomorrow. Wine such as you are used to paying for." It was an investment letter dressed funny. Nothing more. The hall exhaled, disappointed with itself for expecting news. Tywin put the letter aside. "We will receive him," he said. "We will drink his wine and pay as little for it as we can. We will make him like it." "Admirable economy," Tyrion said, lifting his cup as if it too were a ship that required a blessing to keep it from foundering. "I shall write a song on the theme." "You shall sing no songs that mention coin while we have guests with ears," Tywin said, and set his knife to his meat with the same careful pressure with which he would set it to a man if it were necessary. After, Cersei let Jaime find her in the corridor that hooked and bent around the old kitchen chimney. Here the stones were warm even in winter. Now they made the air smell faintly of smoke and roast. Emery. Jaime stopped in front of her, too close in a way that would be read as mere brotherly closeness until someone saw too well. "Will you ride with me in the morning?" he said. "We can put 5 miles between us and the house before anyone knows how far we have gone." "I will be missed within 5 steps, she said. "I am always missed and never wanted. As always you confuse yourself with something like a river," he said. "You are not a river. You are the idea of it. They would miss their idea of you, and we can be generous with ideas without running dry." He lifted his hand and for a moment thought better of whatever he had been about to do with it. He set it on her shoulder in a circle of weight that belonged there. "Come before the house wakes and count the stars that haven't the courage to die." She did not answer. She didn't need to. That night she dreamed of a crown she held not with her hands but with her teeth. A circle of gold that tasted of iron. And she woke with her jaw aching and a word on her tongue that dissolved at once into a taste she recognized as old anger. Dawn came again and the sea came again. Its shoulder pressed against the world as if it were trying to move it. She wrapped herself in a riding cloak and went down. They took the lower gate where the ivy drooped like the hair of a melancholy maid. The dew had made pearls of every blade of grass and left the stable-yard with the look of something just washed. Jaime's horse tossed its head as if it too were impatient. Hers stood as if it had learned that the world came and went and there was no profit in hurrying. She mounted with a grace she refused to make a performance of. 2 guards with the house colors fell in some paces behind. They could not be refused, but they could be ignored. They went west and then north and then west again, turning down lanes that had decided to be lanes on a whim and never been punished for it, past old hoardings where yesterday's notices flapped and tomorrow's would be pasted over them as if in shame. Lannisport receded with the smell of fish and tallow and men who worked too near their fires. The west rolled up to them and then away again, the fields greedy with green where the streams had been coaxed to turn wheels and to keep secrets. In one place, a farmer was teaching a boy to cut grain with a patience that looked like cruelty until one saw the boy's amusements were not being taken from him but renamed. In another, a woman drove geese with a stick, and the geese gave way with their usual theatrics, honking as if their small hearts were too large for their bones. "Once," Jaime said when they reached the ridge from which they could see the rock put its shoulder against the sea like a brute, "we watched a ship go out of the harbor and we said together that it was moving on a road that belonged to no lord. We were children," Cersei said. The wind lifted the hair at her temples and let it fall again. "We thought everything that could not be seen was ours if we believed hard enough." "I still think so," he said. "You are a fool." "Yes," he said, and made it a gallantry. They tell me in the practice yard and in the corridors and in the throne room when I stand too long and let the shadows climb my boots. You are foolish, they say, as they lean too hard on drink and false humility. They envy a man who knows exactly which thing he is. Perhaps that is what foolishness is." She did not look at him. She looked instead at the sun striking coin on the sea, knowing one thing and refusing to be anything else. They returned at noon and the house swallowed them like a mother that has learned to accept that some children must be let loose or they will break their teeth on your bones. The rest of the day happened with the dignity of an old man rising from a stool, with care and with a few small jokes made by those who would not be able to make any jokes at all if the day did not trot to their wishes. Cersei let the seamstress drape her with brocade and pins. She let the woman's stubby, careful fingers make constellations of stitch markers and did not flinch when one pricked her. The brocade was rich without being garish. Lions ran in the weave like a story told to a child to keep it from wandering into the woods. "It will suit," she said at last, and in that sentence a dozen women breathed easier. "Lady," Taya said later, in a whisper that might have been a secret or merely a habit. "The armorer's boy says he saw a sailor with earrings set with stones bright enough to make a magpie faint." "That would be a poorly bred magpie," Cersei said, and closed her eyes while the girl brushed her hair. The bristles made a sound like a room full of bees deciding something serious together. "Order a pair of gloves for me in black morocco. If I do not wear them, I will want them. If I wear them, I will be glad to have them. Yes, my lady. Evening brought Paxter red wine with his cheeks like apples of a different sort than the miller's, fat with the sun and salt and the knowledge of expensive wines. He kissed Tywin's ring without looking, as if he were kissing a ring, and made compliments as readily as he made bargains. He was a man too practiced to be dangerous on purpose and too proud to be a puppet, and Cersei liked him for that. He filled the hall with a perfume of generosity that shepherded the talk into lanes that made trade seem a kind of romance. He had brought his daughter with him, a girl with the coloring of cream and the shape of someone who would someday be worried that she had chosen the wrong husband. The girl looked at Jaime in the startled way all girls looked at Jaime until they learned not to make a posture of it. Jaime did not see her at all. Wine dulled and polished the room, but it could not make Tywin amiable. He permitted himself 3 toasts, one to ships that docked where they said they would dock, one to vintners who did not lie, and one to choices made while sober. The third produced a bark of laughter from Tyrion that the goblet did not hide. "You would make drinkers of us all," Tyrion said, not sotto voce enough, "so that your toasts may sound like sermons and your sermons like ice water." "You talk too much," Tywin said, and the hall tittered in sympathy with the reprimand, as a small bird trembles when a hawk's shadow passes. That night, one that moved more slowly and with more consequence because Jaime's leave had lessened it, Cersei stood on the terrace again and let the dark find her. The sea's voice was lower here. The rock translated it. Jaime came like a shadow that had been asked to wear boots. He leaned where he had leaned before, not touching. "I have been thinking," he said. "Always a mistake. You have never liked thinking. I like it very much when it is done for me." He turned his face to her. She could feel his gaze like warmth. "You will never be content to be merely the lady of a great house." She almost laughed. It sat in her mouth and became something else before it reached air. "There is no mere about that. You know what I mean. Say what you mean," she said, nettled. "You will make a crown for yourself or break your teeth trying. I don't know if I am meant to help you or to be the thing that keeps you from breaking those teeth." "You will be what I decide you will be," she said softly. He made a little sound, a scoff caught and tamed. "And if I decide otherwise? If I am foolish enough to believe that the piece that moves itself may choose its own square?" "Pieces do not choose," she said. "Players do." "Not even when the board is wrong?" he said. "Not even then?" "Especially then." He put his forehead against the stone, and for a moment she wanted to place her hand at the back of his neck the way she had when they were small and he had run too hard and fallen and told her it was nothing. Nothing. She did not. He had held a king's life with that hand and taken it. She would honor it with the distance he used to give his oaths gravity. They stood with the sea's voice and the wind's hands and the stars, which were not brave enough to be seen yet. The ravens came early with a message that the king's hunt had tired of pine and that the king desired to see the west. The letters were full of small complicated courtesies that had been written by a scribe who enjoyed that sort of lace. The gist was simple. Prepare rooms, prepare meat, prepare noise. The king would bring the scent of October in his hair and the memory of stags peculiar to the woods in his mouth, and he would want to forget them immediately. The house quickened. There had not been a royal visit since the rebellion's close, when Robert had come in triumph to take Tywin's hand and to accept a daughter. He had accepted the hand and not the daughter. Cersei remembered the moment with an accuracy that bordered on cruelty. She had watched him laugh, and she had watched her father's smile not quite harden at the edges as he recalculated. Later, when the marriage had been announced from Riverrun, with the river singing loudly to make a ceremony of it, Cersei had been permitted by her father to break a cup of gilded glass against the hearth in her chamber where no one could see. She had cut her palm then and licked the blood and told no one that it tasted like ash. The scar was a memory only she possessed. She rubbed it now with her thumb and felt nothing but a slight ridge, like the haft of a knife under a defeated cloth. The king was announced as if the words themselves wore ermine. He entered with the vigor of a man too used to having doors softened for him. He was larger than Cersei remembered, not in height but in presence. He filled the hall like a story told badly by a man who loves it too much. He embraced Tywin, awkward and sincere, and clapped Jaime as if he were a comrade. He had a mouth for laughter and eyes for disappointment. He kissed Cersei's cheeks and lingered a fraction too long, surprised at something he would not name. He smelled of leather and drink and the sort of clean that happens to men who have been sweating in honest air. "Lady Cersei," he said, and the words were a courtesy, a regret, a curiosity. "The Rock looks the same. The Rock has always prided itself," she said, "on being exactly itself." He laughed. It sounded like what it was. An iron cask rolled down a cellar for the pleasure of the noise. "Our ride from Case was long enough to make me appreciate anything that stood still." "Then you will appreciate our chairs," Tyrion murmured near her elbow, and Cersei wanted then to pinch the bridge of her own nose as she did when a headache thought too highly of itself. The king turned and looked down and laughed openly at the dwarf. He liked men who did not fear to jest while he was near. "Lannister," he said fondly, meaning them all or the one in front of him or the name itself. "You will find me on the practice yard later, and there we will see whether the Rock has softened your arms." "Nothing has softened me," Tyrion said. "I am the hardest thing in the room, and the smallest." The king returned without malice, and went where he was to be made welcome. He ate as if eating were a sport. He drank wine as if it were the blood of some beast he had hunted. He spoke with the surety of a man who knows that words will make the shape of the room because they belong to him. He did not notice when Tywin's silence made a different shape. He was gracious to Paxter Redwine and kissed the Redwine girl's hand too long, and did not see how she tilted her chin to see whether anyone would have the courage to repair it. He asked Jaime if he dreamt of pine, and Jaime said he dreamt of stone, and the king clapped him again for saying what he had not expected. He did not speak to Cersei after the initial greeting except with his eyes, which found her and retreated, uncertain what prize they would win if they stayed. Later, when the hall had filled itself with smoke and the music had learned it could be slightly less careful, he came to her. He came alone, a thing he rarely did, because men were always orbiting him in the hope that some part of him would fall to them like crumbs. "You look very well," he said, and the sentence had a history in it she would not indulge. "So do you," she said, as if compliments were coins to be exchanged for nothing. Her heart sat perfectly in her chest as if it had won a contest for composure. The scar on her palm tingled, or nostalgia made her imagine it. "Have you found the stags you wanted?" "They ran well," he said. "They ran better when I did not have a dozen knights behind me like gossip. You could have told them to hang back. They would have said, 'Yes, your grace,' and then ridden close enough to count my teeth. Kings never ride alone. I haven't decided whether that is a mercy or a punishment." "It depends," she said lightly, "on how well you like yourself." "I like myself immensely when I'm not forced to look at myself," he said and grinned, and she saw then why he had once been the answer to a question she had asked as a child. "What do I do with what has been put inside me that cannot be spent on anything else?" He had been something to spend it on. He had been the most convenient god. "You are welcome at the Rock," she said. "We will make you remember the West as a place where the wine knows its own name." "Ah," he said, "and what does it call itself?" "Victory," she said. He laughed and then looked tired underneath it, like a man who had done too much laughing already that day. He raised a hand. She did not flinch. He let it drop before it reached her shoulder. He had learned some lesson about her once, and though he could not have recited it, he would not forget the shape of it. "I have come to make a nuisance of myself in your practice yards," he said, "and to make a king of myself in your cellars. You will find both accommodating." "Your father," he said softly, with something like respect and something like reluctance. "He keeps his house like a prayer. He keeps it like a ledger," she said, and made it sound like praise. "And some prayers measure the same." He nodded as if he had always known that. He moved away then, to be swallowed by the waxy light and by the need for him others carried like plates that must be filled. Cersei stood in his wake and in the scent of leather and salt and men, who refused to be entirely a disappointment even when that would have been more efficient. She felt Jaime's gaze on her and did not turn. She felt her father's gaze and did not bow to it. The hall breathed in and out. Someone poured wine, and it fell like light down a dark neck. In the days that followed, the king hunted where the rock could pretend it had forests. He pretended to be content with the pretense because men who live on generosity learn how to give it back in little sips. He sat with Tywin and talked about ships and coin as if he were a man who had always meant to speak of ships and coin. He asked Jaime about the men he kept from the king's bedchamber with his sword and whether all men were the kind who needed to be kept. He let Tyrion make him laugh harder than he had meant to and then remembered the laugh and made sure he did not show it on his face when he next saw the dwarf. He watched Cersei walk the long length of the hall and knew that 100 men saw her as he did and that it would make no difference in the things he would choose. He drank Redwine's wine and praised it to the heaven he did not believe in. One afternoon, with a wind that had changed its mind 3 times since morning, Cersei found herself on the high path that skirted the sea cave's mouths, the air cool and damp and always tasting faintly of iron. Taya had begged off with a headache. Cersei did not want her anyway. A boy stood at the path's turn where the cliff grew narrow and the common folk of the rock's shadow came to watch the water batter itself against stone. He had hair the color of straw left out, and he kept his hands in his pockets as if he were worried what they might do if left unchaperoned. When he saw her, he took them out and became someone else entirely, a shape someone had put a lesson into. He bowed clumsily. "My lady, who are you?" she asked without malice. It mattered to people to be asked. "Tom," he said, and then blushed for having said it so small. "Tom Hill. Your mother is?" "Bess, down in Lannisport. Cooks for men who work with boats." "Everyone in Lannisport cooks for men who work with boats," she said. "What do you do, Tom Hill?" He seemed to think about what might be the most impressive thing without being a lie. "I carry messages," he said. "For whom?" "Whoever can pay." "And are they worth carrying?" He looked at her then and surprised her by being older than she had thought. "Only if you know what they say before you say them to the man who needs to hear them." She laughed and did not think to tell him to go. He would go when she was finished. "Do you ever carry them up to the rock?" "Sometimes." He glanced at the sea and then at her. "They don't always let me past the second gate. I suppose it keeps the stones from learning my name and getting ideas." "You are impertinent." "So I've been told." He scuffed a shoe against the path as if that had been what he had meant to do all along. "They said the king was here. I thought I might see him." "You have," she said. "I haven't," he said. "Not properly. Men say he is better than the stories that like him and worse than the stories that don't." "That would make him a man," she said. "Most men are better and worse than their stories. And women—" She thought of the girl who had cut her palm and kept the scar like a private jewel, and of the woman who wrapped herself in hair and anger and learned the tricks of what it meant to not get what she wanted. "Women are better," she said, as if it were obvious. "Or worse, depending on who writes the stories." He smiled at that and seemed to decide that the cliff had become too small to hold the conversation. He bowed again, better. "I will go, my lady," he said. "I have a message to carry." "For whom?" "A man with apple cheeks," he said and grinned, and ran down the path, becoming again who he had been when she first saw him once he rounded the bend. A boy with his hands in his pockets, planning something. When she returned, she found Tywin and the king playing at courtesy with knives. The knives were not literal. If they had been, one or both would have been polite enough to offer the other the first blood. The king was speaking of ships. Tywin was letting him. "We will need to borrow," Tywin said, when a scribe had brought a list of numbers in which the digits danced as if they had paper partners. "The master of coin is inventive. He invents coin where it refuses to be, but we will need to borrow." He looked at Cersei then as if to remind the world that she existed in such conversations because he meant her to. "I would say," Robert said, scratching his beard as if it were a task, "that we have borrowed enough." "You would say that," Tywin said, and somehow made it a compliment and a rebuke at once. "And yet here we sit." Robert laughed softly, as if at a joke he had made to himself in his head when younger and decided he would never tell anyone else for fear they would not laugh correctly. He looked at Cersei. "Do you ever think," he asked, "of the way things might have been if the world had been as tidy as your father's ledgers? That would be a dull world, she said. There would be no stories worth hearing. You and I might disagree there. He set down his cup. His hand shook very slightly, or perhaps the light was playing tricks. I have had all the stories I care to carry. And some you have made yourself, Tyrion put in, from the perimeter he had been pretending not to occupy. I prefer the tales we make. They go where we tell them. They do until they decide to stop, Robert said, without looking at him. That night, in a chamber lit so naturally by moon-sifted light that candles felt like an insult, Cersei sat and thought of Dorne where the stones were warmer and of the north where the stones held cold the way a woman holds a grudge. She thought of the Reach where the houses did not forget to be green. She thought of Riverrun, where a girl had been crowned as queen and had been told to make peace with the knowledge that crowns can be as heavy as they are bright. She thought of the thing inside herself that would not be quieted, the little beast that paced and wore the floor smooth under its ceaseless steps. She thought of the prophecy made to a girl with ripped hem and dirty knees, the muttered words that had smelled of old milk and smoke, the promise that had been made and broken or kept in a way she had not planned. She thought of vows, those made kneeling and those made standing and those made without voice at all. She thought and grew very tired of thinking. On the last morning of Jaime's leave, the house woke too early and could not find the shape of its day. Men walked with too much noise or with not enough. The kitchen sent out a platter of bacon that had been forgotten under a window where wind had cooled it. A maid spilled a pitcher and cried because she had not spilled anything in years. Jaime strapped on his sword with practiced hands and did not look at her while he did it. This was courtesy. She watched him as if he were a fire she had been permitted to warm her hands at twice and would not be permitted again. He looked up at last. "Stay," she did not say. "Take off that white cloak and be mine," she did not say. "2 nights," he said instead, in that schoolboy's tone as if the words were a riddle and if they solved it together something would become obvious. "That will have to do." "It never does," she said. He touched her cheek. It was too brief. It was almost nothing. It was everything. He left and she did not watch him go. She listened to the rock drink the sound of his boots on the stair and thought she would like very much to break something else made of gilded glass, though she had never been given another cup as fine as the one she had smashed years ago. The king left a day later, loud and generous and already bored, and men went with him who would rise because he had laughed at something they had said without remembering it. The hall was emptied, then cleaned, then aired. The rooms in which he had slept were stripped and new sheets drawn over the mattresses with the dignity that even beds have when they have been used by kings. The rock resumed its dignified hum. "Willis Tyrell," Tywin said calmly, as if the sentence were a question that required taking down a book in which all answers had been written in neat columns. "He writes as if he had been taught how. It is a relief to see that men who inherit fields and 1,000 men also inherit the intentions of their tutors." Cersei lifted one brow. "He writes to you?" "He writes to ask after a horse we sold him," Tywin said. "And then he writes again to ask after her first foaling. And then he writes one more time as if he had forgotten what the second letter contained. Men who write to me 3 times about a horse want something else. And you are benevolent. You will allow them to ask." "He limps," Tywin said. "There has been talk. An accident with a horse. It will not do for a woman who wants to ride to be tethered to a man who cannot keep up. I do not choose to be tethered at all." "You do not choose," he said, and the word did not bruise so much as it reminded. "You are chosen." "By whom?" she asked, knowing the answer and resenting being made to ask. "By me," he said. The reply sat in the space between them like a beast that had grown too comfortable and would not be moved. Cersei rolled her hands over one knee. "You want the Reach," she said, "and the Reach wants us. The old wounds can be made to heal if we do not pick at the scabs. It is a neat surgery. The patient may even survive it." "Do not be obscene," Tywin said without heat. "You will marry where I decide you will marry. Or I will not. You will." His gaze rested at her face and then at her hands and then at the window where sea light made the paper on his desk glow faintly. "I am not unkind, Cersei. Kindness is imprecision. But I am not unkind. I might even be tempted to ask you if you would, if I were a different kind of man." "You are not," she said. "Then I will tell you," he said. And there it was, the motion of the world, like the sea's old hand pressed to the small of the rock, like a king's boots against the flags, like a letter rewritten 3 times to become the one it had meant to be all along. Somewhere in King's Landing, a queen was learning again how to be patient with blood and loss. Somewhere in the north, snow had already begun to rehearse itself. Somewhere, a tall, deliberate boy in a hall that smelled of apples was writing his 3rd letter about a horse and thinking of a woman he had never seen except in men's talk. Somewhere, a man with fog about him like a clever fog was inventing coin. Somewhere, a small boy with his hands in his pockets was carrying a message for cheeks like apples and wondering whether the words were any different for having passed through him. Cersei stood. The green dress drew obediently upon her. The scar on her palm made no difference to her grip on the chair she did not need for balance. "If I must write to the Tyrells," she said, "I will want a pen that does not pretend to be a sword." "You will have one," Tywin said. "And if I must ride to the Reach," she said, "I will do it in state. You will do it as my daughter." "That too," she said. She went to the window and touched the warm stone with 2 fingers as if sealing a pact with the house that had made her. But not only. Tywin said nothing. There was nothing to say. He was a man who had taught the world to do what he said. He had raised a daughter who had learned to hear what had not been said aloud. The rock watched them with its particular patience and did not judge either of them. The sea juddered its shoulder against the cliff not because it wanted to move it, but because that was what the sea did. That night she dreamed of a road rising out of the sea like the back of a creature. She walked it and it moved under her feet but did not throw her, only made her learn the new steps that would keep her from falling. When she woke, the world was exactly where she had left it. The gulls were beginning their argument. The wind put its hand to the window and asked without manners to be let in. She knew the day and did not forgive it. She called for Taya. She called for hot water. She called for her hair to be braided. She called for a pen that would make a neat, precise line. She sat with the parchment and wrote to the Reach in a hand that could not be mistaken for anyone's but hers. She wrote about horses and weather and coin, as if she were above flattery and always had been, as if she were the sort of woman whose mind was a place a man could walk without fearing a snare. She sent the letter out in a raven's throat and watched it go and knew how long it would take to fly, and when it would return with a reply that made pretense at being one thing and would be another, and she steadied herself for both. She would not be a queen who waited for a crown to drop onto her hair. She would be a woman who learned which shelves could be climbed and which must be pulled down. Later, when Jaime's rider came dusty and inscrutable with a note that said everything and nothing about his well-being, and when Tyrion brought a story to the supper table about a fishmonger's wife whose wit was sharper than all the men she sold to, and when Tywin read a reply from the Reach that did not mention horses at all, she smiled a small, precise smile that would be mistaken for no smile at all by anyone who mistook her. Outside, the sea kept its counsel. Inside, the rock made no promises and kept them just the same. And Cersei, who had never been given the crown she had been promised in the dirt and the dark when she was a girl, reached for a different sort of circlet entirely, one made of obligation and letters and men's mistakes, and settled it without help where it belonged. She was not content. She would never be content. Contentment is a floor. She was not a woman who slept on floors. She walked forward, and the corridors of Casterly Rock arranged themselves around her, obedient, exact, like soldiers on a wall nodding once as the general passed. In the weeks that followed, there came word of a small tourney held in King's Landing that had ended badly for a knight whose prowess was inversely proportional to his pride. There came a message that the queen had taken to her rooms and would not attend suppers. There came a rumor as unsubstantial as smoke that a certain clever lord from the Fingers had been seen speaking to a woman with red hair at a window above a garden that had forgotten to bloom. There came a different rumor that men in the gold cloaks had been seen speaking with one of Lord Stannis's men with the notched teeth. There came a letter from Lord Stannis himself in a hand that looked like punishment. Tywin read all of it. He folded all of it. He inserted it into his great book in the places where he kept the world. Cersei went to the Sept because one must go to the Sept when one is seen to go to the Sept. and because the habit of kneeling makes certain men relax. She knelt. The mother looked down at her with a face carved by a man who had never met a mother. The crone's lamp had a chip in it and leaned as if to make a new story of balance. The warrior had been given too much thigh and not enough brain. She lit a slender taper and watched the flame bite and hold. "You have never given me what I want," she told them without moving her lips. "I have learned to live with that. It has made me precise. It has made me impossible to fool." On the way back to her rooms, she paused in a corridor where the light always came late. She rested her palm on the stone as she had taken to doing. She let the quiet settle. Tywin would call for her soon to say something that sounded like a decision and was. Jaime would send a letter from King's Landing with a sentence that would not seem important to any eyes but hers. The king would ask too much of his cup and too little of his conscience. And the queen would wrap herself in silence like the cold blanket it had always been for her. The Reach would send more letters with men's words stitched in women's hands. The North would not write anything. The North never did. The world would offer itself, not politely, and she would take the parts that mattered and leave the rest to sob or applaud. She lifted her hand from the stone. The prints her fingers had left were not visible to anyone who did not look for them. Taya came down the corridor on soft feet with a bundle of pale linen and the face of someone who had been given a secret she did not ask for and will never be trusted with another. Cersei nodded to her and moved on. She had not married Robert Baratheon. The crown had gone to a river and stayed there, struggling not to drown. The sea went on battering. The rock went on enduring. She would find another way to make herself the measure by which they weighed their days. When she reached her chamber, the shutters were already open. The wind had made free with a ribbon left on the sill and had carried it to the floor. It lay like something slain, and she stepped over it without slowing, as if to remind all ribbons that their proper place was to be tied and not to be dramatic. She sat at her table and pulled the next sheet of parchment toward her. The pen bit and then moved smoothly, and then began to sing in its small way as it laid down lines that would change men's faces 3 fortnights from now. Her hand did not tremble. The ink did not blot. The light found the page and blessed it, or pretended to. The sea kept talking to the stone. The rock remembered everything and would remind her as needed. She wrote, and she did not look up even when the door opened and Tyrion's dry voice announced a jest he could not help but tell. She had work. There was more of it than she would ever want. Saved her life. The jest was not bad. She did not laugh. She wrote the last line and sanded it, and only then did she lift her gaze to meet her brothers, who had inherited a different sort of cunning and wielded it with a generosity she had never admired. "You are a terrible audience," he said. "I am not an audience at all," she said, signing her name with a flourish she had practiced with all the seriousness of a person practicing sword work. "I am the woman the jester hopes will be amused." "And are you?" "Not often." "Then I must keep my better stories for the king," he said. "He will ruin them with laughter, but the ruin will be useful." He perched on the edge of a chest as if he were a bird who had forgotten it could fly. "You are writing to the Reach." "I am writing to the world," she said, and let the sand fall through her fingers onto the page and thought of glass and what it means to break it and whether there were cups left in the house fine enough to be worth her time. "It does not know yet that it will answer."